Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ben Vinson. I am the Provost and Executive Vice President of Case Western Reserve University, and I'm absolutely honored this afternoon to invite and welcome all of you to the Schubert Center for Child Studies annual Kessler-Freedheim lecture. Inaugurated in 2017 with a focus on child and adolescent research, this lecture series honors Emeritus Professors of Psychology, Dr. Jane Kessler, who I hear recently celebrated her 100th birthday, as well as Dr. Donald Friedheim. Now, their critical efforts laid the foundation for the education, research, and policy work of the center today. And they introduced the core values of equity and inclusion that continue to guide the Schubert Center's efforts. Now, those values are absolutely center stage today, as we welcome renowned social scientist, Dr. Dexter Voisin. Today, we are going to examine how research is conducted, and we'll also examine the impact that research has on communities of color, and especially on children. Now, drawing from almost 3 decades of interdisciplinary research, Dr. Voisin will highlight pitfalls, lessons, and advances that he has made while exploring the factors that influence social and health outcomes among Black and sexual minority youth. Now, it's no secret that the Black community has long been distrustful of the medical community. The Tuskegee syphilis study is a prime example. And this distrust is often a barrier to participation in clinical research. And this has become increasingly apparent now as the COVID-19 crisis has thrust a spotlight on research practices. In fact, one can draw a direct line from early unethical research practices to the fear and reluctance some individuals have towards receiving COVID-19 vaccines today. At Case Western Reserve University, we have a commitment to diversity and inclusion, and we recognize the need to ensure that all research done under our umbrella upholds the strictest ethical protocols. Now, we are grateful that Dr. Voisin has joined us today to explore how complex this issue is and how much work remains to be done. I know, for one, that I'm eager to learn from him today. So thank you, Dr. Voisin, for being here. Thanks to our colleagues, Dr. Adrianne Fletcher, for guiding this afternoon's conversation. Thank you, Adrianne. And to Dr. Edward Barksdale and Dr. Elizabeth Benninger, thank you for sharing your own important efforts on our campus and in our surrounding community. So I'm pleased right now to welcome Dr. Anastasia Dimitropoulos, Director of the Schubert Center, who's going to share more about the center's work and logistics for today's events.
Thank you, Provost Vinson, for joining us today, and good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the faculty and the staff of the Schubert Center, I'm pleased to offer Dr. Voisin and our guests a warm welcome. I want to reiterate our appreciation for Drs. Kessler and Freedheim, whose longstanding efforts to improve the lives of children we honor as part of this annual lecture. I also want to thank our administrators, Dean Ward and Dean Gilmore, who's here with us today, for their continued support of the Schubert Center, and hope that we can gather again in person for next year's lecture. At the Schubert Center, we bridge research, education, policy, and practice for the well-being of children. As we will discuss today, we know that our Black and Brown children are especially at risk of experiencing trauma and violence due to our country's historic disinvestment and continued systemic racism. Every metric of society we examine reveals disparities between Black and Brown youth and their white counterparts. And we know that many of those inequities exist within our research practices and findings. The Schubert Center has committed itself to examining our own work through an anti-racist framework, and we are honored to learn from Dr. Voisin here today. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to recognize our campus co-sponsors and partners, the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences, the Mary Ann Swetland Center for Environmental Health, and the Social Justice Institute. We are grateful for their support. We're also delighted to welcome our community partners for today's event, the Center for Community Solutions, the United Way of Greater Cleveland, and Youth Opportunities Unlimited. Thank you all for the work that you do day in and day out, supporting the youth in our community. And finally, we also extend our thanks to the Schubert family for supporting the work and the mission of our center. Please feel free to share comments and questions throughout today's program in the chat box. Make sure you've selected share with panelists and attendees so that we can all see your comments. Following Dr. Voisin's lecture and our respondents' remarks, we will invite questions through the chat or Q&A feature. I'm delighted now to introduce the Schubert Center Research Director and the Verna Howe Kamato Professor at the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences, Dr. Sonia Minnis.
Thank you, Dr. Dimitropoulos. As Provost Vincent explained, the Kessler-Freedheim lecture was intended to highlight critical voices in child and adolescent-focused research. The work of today's guest, Dr. Wasan, embodies the spirit of the series. Today's event will include an address from Dr. Wasan, followed by a conversation with respondents, Dr. Edward Barksdale and Dr. Elizabeth Benninger, moderated by Dr. Adrianne Fletcher. I'm pleased to introduce the three of them before formally welcoming Dr. Wasan. Dr. Adrianne Fletcher, our moderator today, holds a PhD from Loyola University Chicago and a master's degree in social science administration from the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences, where she currently serves as an assistant professor and our associate dean for diversity and inclusion. Her research focus has been on the influence of implicit attitude and decision-making within the child welfare system, as well as on the phenomena of disproportionality. Dr. Fletcher has been a practicing social work professional over the past 2 decades, with work experience across child welfare, foster care, Indian child welfare, court-appointed special advocates, and veterans who've experienced homelessness. She also provides consultation services, which help to raise awareness of implicit bias and increase cultural humility and flexibility. Thank you, Dr. Fletcher, for moderating today's discussion. Dr. Edward Barksdale, Jr. is the Robert J. Eisend Professor and Surgeon-in-Chief at Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital and Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine. A graduate of Yale University, Dr. Barksdale received his medical degree from Harvard University and completed a residency in general surgery at Massachusetts General Hospital and a fellowship training in pediatric surgery at Children's Hospital Medical Center in Cincinnati. He began his academic surgical career at the Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh and joined RB&C, Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital, in 2007. Dr. Barksdale is devoted to building programs here in Cleveland to address health disparities, particularly among fragile populations of children. He's the co-founder of the Anti-Fragility Initiative, a novel, holistic, person-centered pediatric violence intervention program funded by the Victims of Crime Act. He was recently recognized by Mayor Frank Jackson and the City of Cleveland for his contributions to our community. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Barksdale. Dr. Elizabeth Benninger, one of our discussants today, is the founder and CEO of Healthy Minds, Healthy Communities Consulting, specializing in community and health psychology. She obtained a master's degree in applied community psychology from Antioch University in Los Angeles and a doctoral degree in psychology from the University of Western Cape in Cape Town, South Africa. Her research interests include the study of children's well-being, health disparities, participatory research approaches, and community health promotion. Her work specifically focuses on improving the well-being of children and families within communities experiencing high levels of poverty and violence. She currently serves as a National Institute of Health supported postdoctoral fellow in the CWRU School of Medicine's Department of Bioethics and is an adjunct psychology instructor at Cleveland State University. Thank you, Dr. Benninger, for serving as a discussant today. And now I'm honored to introduce our guest of honor today, Dr. Dexter Wasan. Dr. Wasan has been the Dean of the Factor-Inwentash Factor-Inwentash Faculty of Social Work at the University of Toronto since 2019. He also holds their Sarah Rotman Chair in Social Work. He earned his BA from St. Andrews College, his MSW from the University of Michigan, and a PhD from Columbia University School of Social Work. He has 28 years of Masters of Social Work clinical experience. Prior to his appointment as Dean at the University of Toronto, he was a professor of social work at the University of Chicago for 2 decades and a faculty affiliate at the Center for Study of Race, Culture, and Politics and the Center for Health and Social Sciences. A central focus of Dr. Wasan's research is examining the impact of structural, neighborhood, and police violence on the behavioral and health trajectories of racialized youth and the factors that promote resiliency in the presence of such underlying adversities. Dr. Wasan is the author of more than 155 peer-reviewed publications, secured more than $10 million in research funding, and is a regular contributor to professional organizations as well as local and international media. His research has informed public policy in the state of Illinois, and he is recognized as one of the most influential and cited Black scholars in top-tier schools of social work in North America. His latest project, in his powerful book, America the Beautiful and Violent, Black Youth and Neighborhood Trauma in Chicago, was published by Columbia University Press in August of 2019. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dexter Voisin.
So good afternoon to all. I would like to thank Dr. Menez for that very generous and kind introduction. And you know, it's an honor to be invited by the Schubert Center and have a conversation with what I term lifelong learners. I see all of us as lifelong learners. So I'm going to share a little bit in terms of, you know, my work through the perspective as a clinician, some of my own personal experiences, and really talk a little bit in terms of how I'm becoming more and more conscious in terms of addressing an anti-racist approach in research. And my colleagues and I have been doing this work for almost 3 decades. And 3 decades ago, these words, anti-Black racism, anti-racist researcher, they were not popular words or even known words in our regular vocabulary. So for me, this has been a journey in terms of self-reflection, a journey in terms of reflecting on what sort of narrative I've been telling about these youth for the past almost 3 decades, but more importantly, what narrative needs to be told moving forward. So this is a quote from a university-wide report that we just submitted at the University of Toronto, and my colleagues and I as co-chairs did this work over a 6-month period. And I highlight the cover of this report because it's a quote that I continuously turn to in a lot of my work. It says, "Until the lions have their own histories, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." And in all honesty, it wasn't until about maybe 4 years ago when I started doing research and writing on America the Beautiful and Violent that I became more conscious in terms of what does it mean to be an anti-racist researcher. So having been trained at some really well-established schools, I realized that, you know, in many ways I rang the bell for a good researcher, but I wasn't always anti-racist in terms of my research questions and my approach to dealing with research. So I want to share a little bit in terms of what I mean in terms of situating my own identities, unpack what I mean by white supremacy and anti-racism, because these terms are often used in ways that generate fear, defensiveness, and a lack of reflectivity and conceptual clarity that I think prevents many of us from fully addressing them, and not only in conversations and curricula, but also in our research approaches. And I like to situate for maybe a couple minutes, the ways in which race has been used to advance the narrative of Black inferiority, or ways in which it can be and should be used to decolonize the narrative of urban youth. I'll share a little bit in terms of the story of a young man that I call Marcus, and illustrate between this concept of both loud and silent trauma. And then I would conclude with a few examples of a focus on racial trauma, but more importantly, resiliency. And I think the timing of this talk is very important in light of the George Floyd verdict and what happened yesterday in Columbus, Ohio. Thinking again in terms of, what sort of narratives do we perpetuate about youth of color? And very often the narratives, I think, that we script about young people, those narratives show up in the media, they show up in curricula, they show up in popular culture. And very often, if it's not an anti-racist narrative, those narratives contribute to the marginalization, to the stigmatization, and to the unequal treatment of youth across many different systems of care. So these are a few of the points I like to make throughout the talk. What does it mean to be a critical researcher in terms of my own journey to becoming an anti-racist researcher? Talk a little bit in terms of moving away from race as a flat variable, rather to a social construct that is embedded within structural, interpersonal, and internalized racism. Talk a little bit about the importance of research in context versus a focus on outcomes. I'll talk a little bit about the pitfalls of using just plain black-white comparisons, and then focus a little bit throughout the talk on the notion that there's no value-free research, that the narratives around the lives of these young people are very complex, and it's important not to reduce their experiences to single variables. So I want to start by situating my own identities. So I grew up in the West Indies in my early years and then migrated to the United States. And this is a picture of my mother and my two older siblings. And I recently wrote an article, Navigating the Constellation of Constraints on Black Life. And in this article, I use a quote by Audre Lorde that says, the true focus of change is never merely the oppressive systems we seek to change, but the oppressor that is planted deep within each of us. And I use this quote to really illustrate a very powerful story I learned from my mom at age 5, where she taught me the importance of cultural pride. And she always said, Dexter, make sure when you leave the house, your shoes are shined, your hair is combed, and your clothes look its very best. But while she taught me the importance of cultural pride, based on her own socialization in terms of growing up in a colonized country, she also taught me that whiteness was superior. So I learned these two messages that were often in contradiction to each other: cultural pride and that white supremacy was the norm. And she communicated this by referencing hair texture, skin color, and different ways as a child. I remember her sort of languaging the preference for lighter skin and whiteness. And the point of this is that I share the story in order to illustrate that we can all hold and promote multiple identities that are sometimes in contradiction or in conversation with each other. My own beautiful mother taught me cultural pride while promoting white supremacy ideology. Likewise, women can promote liberal viewpoints and at the same time promote misogyny. Liberal whites and people of color can also promote inclusivity, social justice, and replicate white supremacy ideology in research, teaching, administration, and practices. And as I was preparing for this talk, I started really sort of painfully stripping away, thinking about the ways in which my research might have unintentionally replicated this narrative of white supremacy in its findings and in its approach. And I'd like to share with you some of those pitfalls that I made, as well as some of the pitfalls that I have avoided. So I want to talk a little bit, just for probably 30 seconds, on this whole notion of marginalization, intersectionality, and Blackness. So as social scholars, we're interested in many different types of inequalities, right? So Islamophobia, sexism, ableism, transphobia, anti-Semitism. So all these forms of marginalization are lacerations to the soul and injuries to the human spirit. However, they are not all experienced the same. Individuals who have marginalized identities, but also have the advantage of white skin, it offers them a protection that's not afforded to individuals who have Black skin, where they are not afforded the same levels of cover. So when we think about marginalization, intersectionality, and Blackness, it's a really sort of complex set of relationships, right? So we know that white women, although they experience lower wages in society, Black women experience lower wages relative to white women. If you look at sexual minority individuals, those who are Black have poorer health outcomes versus sexual minority individuals who are white or white appearing, right? So it's important for us when we think about these three concepts to really focus on the whole identity of Blackness and how Blackness shapes the experience of marginalized groups. So this is a story that I refer to very often, and I use it to illustrate the norming of white supremacy ideologies that we are all socialized to. So I reference my beautiful brown mother and her own socialization to white supremacy ideologies that she promoted alongside cultural pride. So there's a story of these 4 junior fishes swimming downstream, and they're met by a senior fish swimming upstream. And the senior fish says to the younger fish, "How was the water today, boys?" And the 4 junior fishes looked complex, confused, and they said, "What water?" Right? They were born into the water. It had become so normal to them to the point that it had become invisible. So Berger and Luckman in their theory talk about the social construction of reality. And I use this to illustrate that white supremacy culture is so pervasive around the world, in North America, in every major society, that it ceases to exist. And if we are not mindful, intentionally mindful, as researchers, as practitioners, as administrators, we have that automatic socialization to replicate these systems without a conscious attention in order to being anti-racist. So all people of color and marginalized groups experience racism and discrimination, but the social mapping of society has already taught individuals from an early age that the closer approximation to whiteness, white aesthetics, white culture, white appearance provides greater opportunity. And the closer you are to Black identified individuals, it creates greater levels or less levels of privilege and opportunity. So I was having a conversation with an Asian colleague of mine some months ago, and she said, all the new immigrants who come into Canada, she tells them, make sure you sound like a white person. You want to sound white. You don't want to sound Asian, right? So there she was both replicating not only white ideology culture, but also socializing folks to the fact that the more that you appear white or white aesthetics, white culture, the greater opportunities you would have in society. So one person said to me, Dexter, you know, I think all of us are a little bit racist. And I like to reframe that in terms of thinking all of us have been socialized to white supremacy culture, including myself. Right? So I use this quote to really illustrate, and I think as Mr. George Floyd's horrific murder has taught us, and the use of video cams, that when we look at Black youth, or we look at populations of color, particularly Black youth, that Black youth are residing in a different America. So James Baldwin says that Americans' history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever written about it, right? this notion that when we think about youth, it's really important to acknowledge the fact that Black youth are living in different ecological spaces, very often marginalized communities. When we think of poverty or income, white poverty is dispersed very differently than Black poverty. So like in Chicago, relative to other major American cities, poor whites live in middle-class white neighborhoods. They have access to schools in upper-class white neighborhoods. They also reside in low-income white neighborhoods, except in Black poor neighborhoods, right? So white poverty is dispersed. Black poverty is concentrated. So when we think about that in terms of the access to relational capital, informational capital, grocery stores, educational systems, the experience of a low-income white person is very different than the experience of a low-income Black person, right? So when we think about research around Black individuals, it's more than just looking at race or controlling for economics. There's a whole set of noise and variables, right? Unmeasured variables that really impact the findings in studies. So the point I'm trying to make here is really to move away from just a flat concept of race and think about the concept of racism and the concept of structural racism, as well as internalized racism. All these things we have to focus on in terms of unpacking and contextualizing the results on the experiences of Black youth. So I mentioned the three different forms of racism here that's embedded in society. And very often research on Black youth, we look at the achievement gap, right, as an outcome, but very little attention is focused on the funding gap, right? So we are continually measuring outcomes and measuring Black kids around white kids, when in fact they're living in two different Americas, two alternative realities, as the experience of Mr. George Floyd has shown us, that the experience of Black Americans, particularly in relationship to law enforcement, the child welfare system, healthcare system, it's a totally different experience, right? So it's really important to look at structural factors rather than an over-attention to outcomes without proper contextualization. My belief system is that leads to further marginalization, a further scripting or a colonizing scripting of young people that further justifies their unequal and racist treatment across different systems of care. So I want to illustrate a little bit about the impact of structural racism. So this is an experiment that's done with fleas. Yes, and you heard me right, fleas. And fleas are put into a glass jar, and after several days, the lid is put on, and the fleas hit the lid. Let's say it's 10 inches, and they fall down. After 4 days, the lid is taken off, and guess what happens? The fleas still jump to the 10 inches, although they have a capacity to jump maybe 18 inches, right? So they become socialized. So even though when situational constraints are removed, the fleas continue to underperform. Now, something else that's really important, not only would those fleas underperform, but their offsprings would also similarly underperform. And I think this is very often a metaphor in terms of the impact of the multi-generational impact of systemic racism. We're not just talking about the constraints of one generation, but how those constraints become replicated across multiple generations. I also think about environmental violence, like the unfortunate incident in Flint, Michigan, with lead poisoning. And scientists have told us that the neurological damages for those kids are not only going to persist for their lifetime, but those neurological damages would also be transmitted to their offsprings. So again, all these are factors we need to think about in terms of when we work with Black populations. So Vessel van der Kolk talks about when trauma gets under the skin, how the body keeps the score, right? So when we think about the neurobiology of trauma, right? When we think about systemic trauma, and when we think about multi-generational trauma, all these things, even though they're not being measured, we have to keep them in the back of our minds as concepts and think about when we interpret results or frame results, how do we think about these larger structural factors influencing the interpretation and the presentation of results that are coming forth on Black youth. Now, this is a little clip that encapsulates a lot of what I've been talking about in terms of the importance of context. I'm just going to play this for a few seconds.
Welcome back to News Nation. We have a special report tonight on violence in America.
Philadelphia, for example, having its deadliest year since '07. Shootings there are up 57% over last year. And in New York City, the number of shooting victims is up almost 100% to date over last year. According to the Chicago Sun-Times newspaper, there have been 624 homicides in Chicago so far this year, up from 510 in 2019.
So why are certain neighborhoods more violent than others? What's behind the violence in areas like Inglewood on Chicago's South Side? Dexter Voisin has a lot of thoughts on that. He's a professor at the University of Toronto, but also spent 20 years at the University of Chicago. He explores the reasons and some solutions in his latest book, America the Beautiful and Violent.
The abhorrent has become the norm. The abhorrent around violence in Chicago, and in fact, violence across all America has become the norm. In Chicago, 50 individuals can get shot in a weekend and will barely make the evening news. We become desensitized, and I think that desensitization is a manifestation of our collective trauma.
So there are two main questions here. Why does it happen, and how do we solve it? You talk at length in your book about the whys, and it's complicated.
So if you have kids growing up in communities of deep need, where there are no jobs, where they don't see positive images of themselves, where the middle class has been stripped, where fathers, sons, and brothers are incarcerated at disproportionate levels, not because of criminality, but purely a function of the zip codes that they're growing up in, then you would find the manifestation of these forms of interpersonal violence. When young people do not see positive images, they don't know what they can become.
What would someone coming from a resourced neighborhood think after spending 3 months in Inglewood?
I think they would be shocked and they would be appalled. I think there are a lot of folks who are living in privileged spaces who don't understand that individuals are living in an alternate reality in these United States of America.
Where does this break down? The lack of humanity.
If many of these issues were happening in well-resourced communities, resources would have been put to stop the problem. Violence in poor, under-resourced communities is a man-made problem, and it takes man-made actions in order to solve them. If you teach someone to not see their lives as valuable, they're not going to have respect for their lives and for the lives of other people that look like them. If someone is being told from the time they're born through media, through living in a circumstance, substandard housing, in schools that very often resemble prisons because of metal detectors, they're told that your life is less meaningful. That person is not going to invest in their future.
Some people will say, and you write about this in the book, about personal responsibility, making a choice other than crime, other than drugs, other than picking up a gun and shooting someone.
What I've heard from these young people, my dream was to become a policeman, a fireman, a teacher, and some other type of gainful employment. But along the lines, they've realized that the path to that has not been extended to them. So that goes back to the old adage of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, when in fact, some folks have no boots or no straps. But the reality. So that video talks a little bit about context, and I'm just going to bypass these slides in terms of, again, internalized racism and socialization that comes from birth, and the negative and damaging weathering effects it has on Black youth. I want to talk a little bit about situating race within science, right? So again, the scripting of Black-white comparisons. When I started doing this research almost 30 years ago, many colleagues said to me, well, Dexter, where's your white comparison group? Right? And again, the notion that unless you have a white comparison group, your research is not meaningful. And I think even at that point in time, I wasn't that interested in comparison groups because I said, you know, I know kids are living under different circumstances. And what would these results show me other than Black kids are underperforming because it's a resource issue? So for my research, I've really sort of stayed away in many cases because I'm primarily focusing not only on Black youth, or even if I have other types of racial groups, I understand that all these kids are living in different ecological spaces. And it's really important not to just lump them into the same sample without proper context, without measuring the appropriate variables that are important to each subgroup, right? So without having access to those variables or resources to do that responsibly, I have stayed away from making those sort of flattened comparisons, right? Within group differences, I think it's a really important point in terms of focusing on resiliency and looking at the complexity of the Black youth experience without having to make that comparison meaningful by comparing them with the dominant group. In some of my earlier research, you know, I go back now and I look and I say, you know, there were real gaps here in terms of not only framing the findings, but what is my attention to race? Race as a complex construct. And I think for all of us as researchers, even though we are not measuring racism, we are not measuring structural racism, it's really important to give some attention, some meaningful attention to the context of race. So when I'm working with colleagues and they say, okay, Black youth report higher rates of sexual risk behaviors, higher rates of STDs, and they move on, I'm like, now, when I see that, it causes me a lot of anxiety because I say without proper contextualizing, it comes back to an individual explanation of outcomes, which again perpetuates a colonial narrative. The importance of looking and controlling for poverty. And as I had mentioned before, that white poverty is very different than Black poverty. So it's more than just controlling for economics as a control variable. We have to think about racialized poverty. We have to think about how poverty shows up differently for whites versus Blacks. All the studies we've had in terms of controlling for economics and SES around healthcare outcomes and longevity, we know that if you control for socioeconomic status for whites versus Blacks, that the same income Blacks have poorer outcomes than their same income peer whites, right? So economics do not tell the whole story. It's all the layers that are constructed around race and racism that's very often not captured in social science. I want to talk a little bit about the story of Marcus, right? And the whole notion of loud versus silent trauma. So when we think about the daily constraints of Black life, this is a quote from Bessel van der Kolk. And I use it in reference to talking about the impact of racism. No one can treat a war, abuse, rape, molestation, or any other horrendous event for that matter. What has happened cannot be undone, but what can be dealt with are the imprints of the trauma in the body, mind, and soul, the crushing sensations in your chest that you may label as anxiety or oppression, the fear of losing control, always being on alert for danger or rejection, the self-loathing, the nightmares, the flashbacks, the fog that keeps you from staying on task and from fully emerging in what you're doing, being unable to fully open your heart to another human being. But this whole notion that trauma is both loud and silent. Very often we think about trauma in terms of the loud trauma, the George Floyd, the Breonna Taylor, right? Mass suicides, other forms of police violence. And as horrific as these are, they represent just a fraction of the violence that takes place in Black and low resource neighborhoods, primarily because of poverty, right? So it's important for us to think about the silent trauma, the non-fatalities, the witnessing violence, experiencing gun victimization, the structural and internalized racism, the racialized poverty, right? And very often, these are not just located to the young Black people on the streets. Individuals, Black and brown individuals in well-resourced institutions in corporate America, in academia, also experience silent trauma, the constraining of Black lives, the constraining of opportunities, right? So I think very often the media draws our attention to the loud trauma, to the mass murders, to the police violence, right? But when you think about the experience of Black youth in underfunded schools, the experience of internalized racism, structural inequality, differential treatment in the child welfare system and in juvenile justice systems, all these layers of trauma and violence that are confronting Black and brown bodies on a daily basis. So some of the theories in terms of really sort of moving away to more complex narratives, these are a few of them that I've highlighted, right? Critical race theory, looking at the importance of intersectionality, minority stress theory, and community-based participatory research is very important, but it's not a silver bullet, because not all community partners have the same acumen or capacity for dealing with Black youth. And we are doing a study in Chicago now, and we constructed a survey looking at the aspect of resiliency. And I had some of my junior colleagues construct these items. And when it came to me, I was like, wow, this survey is really depressing. There's very little about resiliency on it. The questions were very judgmental. The qualitative focus questions were you not engaging in risky sex before you became infected with HIV? Very judgmental. And we really had to work with the team to reframe those questions in terms of tell us about what was happening in your life around the time when you became infected with HIV. Looking at the future orientation scale, a lot of it was focused more from a scripting of negative. We had to flip that, reverse order the scale in terms of make it more positive. And I said to myself, how would a young Black youth going through this survey, how would they experience that survey, right? What the survey was actually doing in its raw, unfiltered, and racist approach in many ways. It wasn't really anti-racist. It was re-scripting the deficit-based narrative of these youth, right? And part of the takeaways, again, we are all sort of socialized because of our universal socialization in terms of white supremacy to do that. So it really takes a conscious effort. So I'm going to move really quickly throughout these few slides here in terms of thinking about racial trauma as a syndemic. Similar to the ACE studies, we've been looking more now in terms of trauma, looking at it through a syndemic lens, looking at it through an iterative lens. So not only looking at community violence, police violence, traumatic police stops, race-related violence, but looking at all the forms of violence that are disproportionately impacting Black youth. And again, it goes back to making sure that our studies have context in them so that, again, the narrative isn't scripted from just personal responsibility, personal choice, but we pull that conceptual lens back so that we can look at the broader set of factors influencing youth. I just have a few minutes left, so I'm just going to go through this really quickly, but these are some earlier studies we looked at in terms of conceptualizing the impact of neighborhood trauma on risky sexual behaviors and looking at some of the mediational pathways, again, looking at school engagement. And when we look at school, we have to unpack looking at resourcing, looking at racial segregation, de facto school segregation. We know that many of the schools in the United States are almost as segregated as they were in the 1960s. All right, and in some cases, schools are getting resegregated. Looking at protective factors in terms of parenting strategies in the face of violence. This is another study where we looked at youth coping, and we found that many of the youth in low-income communities were using school as a leverage to get up and out of their communities. This finding really sort of challenged that colonial narrative around Black youth using violence to combat violence. This was not something that we found as a predominant coping strategy. Again, looking at a whole notion of future orientation, which is something that we found has really been very protective for Black youth. And this is a study that we are doing now in terms of looking at continuous traumatic violence, looking at violence across this endemic framework, looking at neighborhood violence, police violence, race-related violence, in terms of racism, peer violence, childhood sexual abuse, and family disruptions. And we know that many of the disruptions in Black neighborhoods come about as a result of over-policing, right? And here we have parental trauma. Again, very often we look at youth without adequate attention to their caregivers who are similarly traumatized by not only police and neighborhood violence, but by racism, right? Looking at protective parenting strategies and looking at future orientation. So pulling together a lot of the protective factors that we found over the years and really putting it into a well-conceptualized model to look at youth developmental outcomes. And again, focusing on the notion of mental health, trauma. Many kids are the walking wounded, right? In communities, they're showing up in schools, but they're still wounded. They're traumatized, they've witnessed violence, seeing images of individuals like themselves repeatedly killed by police, another form of violence. All right, so I'm going to stop here and really open it up for some questions. And I just really want to thank you for your time and your attention today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Voisin, for sharing so clearly about the historic and white supremacist underpinnings of violence in Black and Brown communities, and also for holding space for Black and Brown people, especially youth, at all of their complex intersections. Thank you also for helping us to begin to reframe how we do research in the academy, especially as it impacts those youth who are Black and Brown. Today, as we continue to engage with each other by way of responses from Dr. Barksdale and Dr. Benninger, and from questions from you, our audience, we hope to give the lion an opportunity to share his narrative. And if it's okay with you, Dr. Voisin, we're going to turn to Dr. Benninger first for responses, and then we'll hear from Dr. Barksdale, and we will move on to questions from our audience.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the presentation and the book as well. I really enjoyed reading it, and it resonates so strongly with the work that's being done here in Cleveland and the work that I've also been involved in Cape Town, South Africa, where although very different social and cultural contexts, huge similarities when it comes to structural violence and inequalities, especially facing Black young people in both cities. Just a couple of points to comment on in relation to research here in the Cleveland context. The methods that I really promote through my research really values what you pointed out as research and context. I've struggled with trying to looking at research that paints this very negative picture of the lives of young people in our city without the context, really just based on race, which is a social construction that needs to be understood in context. And so I think there's a real need for creative methodologies to be utilized, especially with young people. So approaches that I've used are participatory research methods with children and youth, especially participatory action research, which really requires prolonged engagement in the community, on the ground, building trust, really coming into their lives and being a part of it, and showing that you're invested in their lives and their well-being, and then building the research with them from there. So I'm a part of 2 studies right now. One is focused on children and youth who are in neighborhoods experiencing some of the highest health disparities in our city or in the greater Cleveland area. And then another focused on children who have had or who have incarcerated parents in Cuyahoga County, where the county that Cleveland's located in. And so with both approaches, we've done a lot of different strategies to engage the youth, from just showing up at different youth events and community spaces and spending time there, and then developing youth advisory boards that can lead the different stages of the research process, where they really guide the questions that we ask, the way we ask them, the tools that we use, such as photo voice, and drawing out maps, doing videos, things like that. So I think that's really essential. And then there's always a direct action piece tied to that too. So the youth know that it's not just about us publishing these papers on their lives, that it's really about their lives leading to significant improvements because of the work that we're doing, and doing that collaboratively. So those are just some ways that I try to do research in context and make it empowering and impactful for young people. And then just the last point that I had is on the practice side of things as well. In academia, we develop these interventions. We use things like randomized controlled trials, and then there's a significant lag between when those interventions actually reach the populations they're intended to serve. And we tend to overlook the value in the knowledge gained through community practice and what's already known in the community. And so I think we need to be on the ground more in communities, and we need to be careful of how we report our findings as well, because sometimes they show, because of our heavy focus on the outcomes, which we often choose the wrong outcomes, or we can't capture the complexity of the outcomes. It shows that these programs aimed at reducing violence or improving mental health aren't working, and then they don't get the support that they need, when actually they are working. And if you engage the community and ask why, and especially the young people most affected, that's where you really see the impact. So just to think about that.
Thank you, Dr. Benninger, for your responses. We'd like to turn now to Dr. Barksdale for a brief response as well. Dr. Barksdale, can you unmute, please?
Thank you. Dr. Voisin, I so enjoyed your talk and your book. As a surgeon and someone who speaks medically, I had my own PowerPoint talk to show, to ask my questions or make my comments, and I don't want to upstage your talk, so I will avoid my talk. But my talk had my questions and images, and so they're really not data. And so the first is that in reading your book created some trauma for me, because in many ways I am that kid. I'm that kid who got out of that neighborhood, who adapted my speech, my diction, my vocabulary, my dress, so that I could blend in. But as we mentioned in our pre-talk, as I watched the unfortunate death of George Floyd, I related to that, because in many ways, even in my professional setting, I feel like I can't breathe. I experienced that silent trauma, and many of us, men and women and LGBTQ people of color, feel that it is difficult to be our authentic self. I'm running a national program in our field talking about microaggressions, and I listened last night as some young person talked about calling them out, but I can't call out microaggressions in my environment. That comes back to haunt us. So I so appreciated your comments in your book, your use of data and narrative, and the diagram that I have in my talk that I will just send to you speaks to my second point. I understand that we talk about the term resilience, And while you were speaking, I looked up what it said about resilience in the dictionary, because I don't believe in resilience, not when it comes to this. And resilience is the ability of a substance or object to spring back into its shape. When you think about these young people we see on this in the urban communities, when I look in the mirror and think about myself, the world has broken me, but I am now stronger in those broken places. So as Hemingway said in Farewell to Arms, the world breaks everyone, but afterwards, many are stronger in the broken places. I would like to challenge you to think of a new term instead of resilience. It's the term that we use for our program, which is called the anti-fragility. And as you know, Nassim Taleb's book, Anti-Fragile, is that those things that are strongest are those things that break and then are healed again, much like and the Japanese kintsugi art, that it's broken, but the gold epoxy adds value. And so our program takes children ages 6 to 15 years. We are a holistic, person-centered violence intervention program that targets kids who are 6 to 15 who've been shot, stabbed, and beat up. And we say we're person-centered because we are strengths-based, as you discussed here. So much of intervention that we grew up is deficit-based. And in order to help children recover, and in order to be better than they were when they were traumatized, we need to think about helping them to develop their own individual strengths. So we use anti-fragility as a surrogate for post-traumatic growth. And so I would invite you to think about that and think about how resilience doesn't capture it. And then the final piece is that it gets back to this term that relates to how you started, the walking wounded. My grandmother, who'd be 134, somehow discovered this quote about the lion. And she would often say that to me, that you have to remember you are the lion, but you may not be able to script your own narrative. And she would correlate, the corollary to that was that even in hunger, a lion never eats grass. And that in some ways, and that's a Tamil, not an African quote, that in order to be strong, in order to be anti-fragile, we need to think of ways, if we cannot tell our narrative, that we can still maintain our pride and be healed. So I so appreciate the opportunity to comment. Thank you for the organizers for including me. This has been great.
Dr. Barksdale, as you're talking, I'm smiling because you're absolutely right. The point you made about resiliency talks about the power and the limits of words, right? And the way we've sort of scripted the narratives around these kids, even though scripting it from a resilient standpoint, further creates a colonial narrative. And I'll say why. Because, and I use some of these terms, like we use some of the terms to the DSM-5 and so on, because they're publicly recognizable terms, right? But when you start unpacking them, there are problems even with some of these kind of framings. Because if you think about the definition that you did, the ability to sort of bounce back, when trauma gets under the skin, you're never the same person. You don't come back to baseline. There's nothing as sort of coming back to baseline. And very often when folks are traumatized and they're actually displaying, in some cases, survival behavior, they're actually lauded for being resilient, right? For bouncing back without looking at the structure, the trauma, and how we ourselves contribute to that trauma, right? So they become applauded for that. So it goes back again to the power and limits of words. With young people, I've stopped referring to them as at-risk youth, because that in itself scripts a particular narrative. And without proper context, folks start thinking the risk lies within the individual. I talk about them as opportunity youth, right? And what we call the ability to thrive or post-traumatic growth, those things happen because of resources or relational aspects, right? Or access to other types of capital. So we can't, fully blame someone for not being resilient or fully applaud them. It's a complex set of dynamics that show growth for one group under similar circumstances vis-a-vis another group, right? So the limits of words, but read a book and I talk about the limits of words, including resiliency. So I appreciate you highlighting that point.
Thank you, Dr. Voisin, Dr. Benninger, I'm going to get that right before our time is over, and Dr. Barksdale. There are some questions coming into the chat right now, and I'd really like to hopefully encompass a few of them with this notion. You crystallized for us the idea of how we are all unwittingly socialized into white supremacy, right? It starts very early on during our formative years. And as a result of this, we step into our academic spaces and we set out to do research. We are well-intentioned in the academy, well-intentioned researchers, but we have a specific lens. And that is a lens that is undergirded by white supremacy. So Dr. Voisin, one question is, how do we intercept that? What do we do in the academy in order to stem the tide of that type of research? And I know Dr. Benninger, you touched on that just a little bit, but I'm wondering if you can speak more to that. How do we stem the tide?
Yeah, so for me, I think, there are probably several different ways, but for me, it's really about being very intentional. If we think about an automatic default drive, is to re-strip white narratives around supremacy so that not only are white individuals inferior, but how when we're also drawing from a body of research over several decades that have also re-scripted that, right, replicated that. So when we go to the literature, one of my younger trainees who was working on this project said, well, I scripted the problem in terms of, haven't you been engaging in risky sex? Because that's what the literature talks about, right? So the fact that the literature is value-free, is bias-free, and somehow going to the scientific literature, right, is a very positivist approach. And I said, no, there's no value-free approach. So even in terms of thinking about, for me, the default is a colonial narrative. So it means being very intentional. When I'm working with colleagues as well as working on papers now, something is said about Black and brown people, I want to make sure that it's contextualized. It's not just a statement of fact that's added to another statement of fact, when in fact it's errors added to errors, right? And it sort of strips the whole story from a deficit base. I'm very intentional. Context. And with the results, again, there are probably a whole host of unmeasured variables, right? No one study can do it all, right? But really focusing on the not only construction of race, but the impact of structural inequality, right? And really situating that within findings. So it has to be intentional. If not, the default is a colonial approach.
Yeah, thank you for that. Dr. Benninger, would you like to respond to that as well?
Sure. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And it's something that I have really grown and continue to grow and develop and realize in earlier stages that I failed to provide the appropriate context to my research. And I always make sure to intentionally do that now, whether it's when I'm presenting findings or publishing a manuscript, that it needs the context. And kind of building off of the discussion on resilience, something that I learned from the study that I'm working on now is that when we spoke about resilience with the young people who were 14 to 18 years old, they spoke partially about it as this internal quality, but more strongly about their understanding that resilience was so dependent on the resources available and accessible in their neighborhoods and in their lives. And so it's very important that when I even contextualize what they're speaking about, I speak to the context of Cleveland, the history of redlining and racial zoning, and why resources are dispersed very differently for young people in our city, largely based on race because of the history of racism in our city. So it's essential, and I can't report on research findings without really doing that, without providing that context. And then also just the value in qualitative methods where you can capture the narratives in context and provide that level of depth that's needed to really understand young people's experiences.
Might I make a really brief comment to that? Because I know there are other questions, but I think this is so important. We put a lot of this on the individual. I mean, that's the challenge I have with resilience. We put a lot of this on the individual recovery and how things move forward. There's that, again, African quote that it takes a village. I hate that quote because, when we think about it takes a village to raise a child, who's raising the village? And so that as those of you who are in the realm of social work, I think so much we have to think about communities and that our children who are suffering here didn't get there on their own. It is the broken community or village where the investment really needs to occur to make them more anti-fragile because they've built their own internal strength and they can be put back together. I'm sorry, I know you have other questions, but I wanted to get that.
Well, Dr. Fletcher, could I bounce off something that Dr. Barksdale said?
Absolutely.
As you're talking, Dr. Barksdale, I'm thinking about, in terms of how we are socialized primarily in academia to think about knowledge that's coming from the academy as superior in many ways to the knowledge that's coming out from communities or indigenous communities, right? And although we conduct community-based participatory research, we are holding the purse strings. We have the resources, right? We are sort of filtering. We have the ability to filter and to edit what's coming forward, right? Those things are also shaped by our own biases as well, right? So there's still a filtering position opportunity that takes place in terms of what we foreground versus background. And I think it's really important when we do this type of research to see expertise as different, as equal, but not different. So the expertise that comes from community, I see community partners when I go in, regardless of whether it's a high need community or not, the expertise that comes from those families, for me, very often I feel so humbled because there is nothing that I could dream looking at a literature review or going back to any prior studies, right? It's really sort of powerful information. And to give a quick story, we were doing a study looking at parenting in the face of neighborhood violence. And one dad said to me that probably a couple times a month, he'll take his son outside of this very insular, racialized, where there's a lot of redlining and racial segregation, out into other communities so he can see how people live outside of those communities. And I said, and what was the reason for doing that? He says that how we are living now is not the norm. This is not how the rest of America lives. And that was such a powerful moment for me because what he was trying to instill in his son is this notion of a sort of future orientation, right? And I went back and I said, what is this that he's trying to capture here? And because of that experience, we started looking at future orientation, and we found that even in the face of all these type of adversities, that tends to be a very reliable buffer against social adversities, right? So then how do we create interventions or how do we create interactions with young people that ignite this notion of a future when you have all these structures around them that tell them you have a limited future or limited capacity?
Thank you. Thank you for that response to Dr. Barksdale's comment. So there's a question in the chat that goes right along with what you were just commenting on. And the question is, do you think it's time for lions to fight for their survival? Or is there more that can be done to banish hunting seasons? So we can grapple with that first part of the question. Do lions fight? Should they fight? Or can we banish hunting season?
So Dr. Barksdale, do you want to jump on that one?
So I am innately nonviolent. And I think that the strength of the lion is in the pride, and the pride of the lions is in the lion. And so the point is that it's having strong community that we build, that lions live, although we think of them as singular animals, they really live in community. And so I think that having other members of our lion community come from Toronto to Cleveland allows us to think strategically about growing our pride and building what we have. So that's how I might answer that is this concept and metaphor of lion and pride and group and community.
But I also think about, how do we use our positionality within visible spaces to make sure that those voices are also elevated, right? Bringing them to those spaces. So one of the things that I'm very intentional about is using my location as a Black male to elevate the voices of young people. So, when I do some of these book talks or these other conversations, I bring in some of those community voices, spoken word artists, to present alongside me so that they are also amplifying their voice through their gift and through their expertise to tell the story. And I remember sitting in a Starbucks cafe where I did a lot of writing for this book because it was a snapshot of the community that I was living and working in. And many of the young Black folks would say to me, "Who are you writing this story for?" And would really sort of interrogate me about my politics before they opened up to tell me their stories. And very often I'll come back to them and I'll say, "This is what I'm hearing. What am I missing?" Doing a talk back with them. Because I know that my lens is not bias free, right? Even though I'm Black, I'm in certain locations that's different than some of their lived realities, right? So I think it's really important to do this talk back, but to also use our position and our privileges to make sure that those voices are also elevated. Elevated not only in presentations, elevated in terms of, opportunity to bring them into spaces that they may not have opportunity to be in, but also elevate their expertise on some of these sort of traditional platforms that we occupy.
Thank you, Dr. Voisin. Dr. Benninger, would you like to respond at all to that notion?
Sure, and I think I definitely try and make a conscious effort to do similar things, not only to represent the voices of the young people who I work with accurately through making sure that anything that I share is through checking with them, that anything I share is actually capturing it accurately. Although there is that power divide with academia, and that we spoke about with like the filter and the language that we're forced to use, the jargon when we're presenting our findings that isn't always accessible, especially when you're working with children and youth. And so I also recognize that that's a challenge. So for example, this Friday I have two of our high school youth presenting at the Midwest Psychological Association conference with me. But I'm also very mindful that that conference is a very intimidating space for these people to be in, not only because they're Black, but also because they're not in academia. They're not used to speaking in the same terminology that we use. It's extremely intimidating. So recognizing that while I value the fact that the APA is trying to be open to young people being in these spaces, is that enough to make them feel comfortable and welcomed in those spaces? Another example is one of the youth is going to the Public Health Association conference with me in October. However, they still would like to charge $600 for that youth to attend that conference. Is that really accessible for young people? So just thinking about, the need to share these spaces to give voice, but then our obligation and our role as academics to create spaces that are actually accessible, not only physically because of things like financial means, but also psychologically for diverse populations and not just for academics.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So in light of belongingness, and I really think that's what you're speaking to, Dr. Benninger, what it's like to go to these conferences when you, when all of this is very new for you, right? And so Dr. Voisin, there was a question about future orientation, and I'm just wondering if this notion of being more inclusive as we think about bringing young people into these spaces really helps us to think about future orientation.
Yeah, and I think, what Dr. Benninger mentioned is important, but I also think about, like opportunities to bring them into the spaces that we occupy, right? Bring them onto college campuses, bring them into, into the classroom. But just many kids on the south side of Chicago said to me, we don't go to the north side because we are not welcome there, right? And although, the legal distinctions around moving into white spaces are no longer there, those psychological and social barriers are still there, right? And I think very often, again, in terms of helping kids to see spaces that have been traditionally not accessible to them, there are ways we can do that, right? And I think, for those of us who are in the academy or other spaces, creating opportunities for them to just come in, be in a space. We have a program, have the program at the university. Very often those kids have not even stepped onto a university, and how could they become what they've never seen, right? Just bringing them into a different space starts opening up ideas for possibilities. So I think, some things cost resources, but some things are just pivoting access to existing resources that are already there.
Anyone else like to respond to that notion of future orientation and belongingness? All right, so then why don't we just take a few moments to think about, and you mentioned this earlier, Dr. Voisin. Can you all hear me okay?
You dropped a little bit.
All right, how is that? Is that better? Am I in?
Headphones. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So Dr. Voisin, you mentioned earlier about always needing a white comparison group, right? And how you wanted to step away from that notion. If we all think back to literature, we'll remember that Toni Morrison specifically talked about not writing toward a white audience. So she was already leaning into that piece that whiteness and white supremacy does not have to be our watermark. So can you speak a little more to that idea about having a white comparison group? And if we don't have a white comparison group, what does our research look like?
Right. Well, very often, I think the reality is, it's, I've heard from Black colleagues, they've said, I want to study Black individuals. And the sort of signaling they've gotten is that, well, that's not really a very valid topic to study. Or because you're Black, you're going to not have scientific objectivity because you're studying somebody within your own group, right? When these are very often not the same standards that are held to white researchers, right? White researchers could study anybody across the diaspora, and the whole notion of objectivity or credibility is never questioned. So I think the reality is, as researchers of color, we have to frame our research in particular ways in order to legitimize it, right? And particularly if you're on a tenure track. So when I started doing this research, one well-intended colleague said to me, Dexter, you'll never get tenure studying community violence because you can't prove causality, right? And in order to make this a worthwhile topic, you have to prove causality. And, that sort of threw me off a loop, a senior colleague telling me this at a very junior stage. I had a scratch my head moment, and I really thought about it. But then I started saying, okay, for me, I had to start coming up with a conceptual framework that would explain that relationship. And when I started, making pitches to conferences, they said to me, what does neighborhood violence have to do with risky sex, right? And part of the takeaway was that risky sex has a lot to do with the individual determinants, not the social constructs in terms of the environment, right? It's really about individual choice. And I started using scientific tools, research methods to start doing conceptual formulation, right? To really account for pathways using the literature and then testing those pathways, right? So I think, again, whatever environment I think you are in terms of a researcher of color, figuring out if this is a route you decide to go, what are the requirements for success? Using the language of the hunter, but also taking it and scripting it in a way where it tells the story of the lion.
Thank you, Dr. for that response. And we have about 5 minutes, just 5 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is to give each of you an opportunity for any closing remarks. And I think Dr. Barksdale, you were ready to make a remark. So I'm going to open the table up to you first.
No, I wasn't ready to make a remark. It's sometimes probably adult ADD that you see here, but I'd like to say that this has been a very provocative presentation for me. The interchange helps me understand better how to be better for the children and families that I serve. I think so strongly, particularly after the events of yesterday and the months before, that we're in a space of collective trauma and that we need strategies for collective healing. And that healing is not going to occur over the next month or the next year, but it is important. I'm often reminded of the quote that hurt people hurt people. But in thinking of it from a positive perspective, and as a surgeon, as a healer, I strongly believe that healed people heal people. And this is the type of dialogue that helps to train healers from a variety of perspectives to learn how to be healed from our own traumas so that we can heal those who are still suffering. And so again, I thank all the panelists. I hope I pronounced Dr. Benninger's name correctly. I appreciate the perspectives that you offer, Dr. Voisin. I appreciate you as well. And I hope that I will be better, a better healer, a better person, more authentic in my approach to children and families that we serve. And also collectively, if we deal with collective trauma, the city of Cleveland and Northeast Ohio. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Barksdale. Dr. Benninger, any closing remarks?
Sure, it's hard to summarize all this, the wonderful conversations and things that we've spoken about today, and some of the very insightful things added in the chat. But I think what's so important is that as researchers that we stay very intentional and authentic in our work, and that we always make sure we're doing everything in our power to provide voice for those who our work is intended to serve, or for those whose lives our work is intended to help in some way. And so that means just really being authentically present with young people in their spaces, and as well as when we bring them into spaces that they may feel less comfortable in, or in white spaces that often form academic conferences and things like that, that we're really intentional about how and why we do that, and that we're really creating spaces for meaningful engagement of young people and community members in those spaces as well. So I guess those are some of my key takeaways and closing remarks, and thank you everyone for being a part of this really important conversation today.
And thank you, Dr. Benninger. You are correct. Difference is made when we have these conversations in small spaces. And for us, this was a small space, but a larger group. So lastly, I want to give the last just 60 seconds to Dr. Voisin for any closing remarks.
So I just want to thank the Schubert Center, the organizers, for this just really unique and opportunity to just share among colleagues. And, I see all of us as lifelong learners around these issues. And I think for me, it's important to move away from, so that we could really engage in really productive, generative discussions around the whole notion around research and constructing, is to move away from the nouns. Very often we get fixated on, who's a racist, who's a sexist, and really look at the larger set of structures into which we are all born and socialized. And I think that fosters or encourages more productive dialogue. But I think it's also important to make sure that we are very intentional with the type of questions we're asking, that there are layers to our socialization. It's like peeling an onion. You think you've come to a certain amount of awareness. But I think 10 years from now, history and science would tell us what we think is really progressive today is not so progressive through a lens of 5 years forward into the future. And I think to approach this work with humility, with critical self-reflection, and again, to always ask ourselves, whose story is being told by the questions and inquiries, and whose interest is being served by asking particular questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Voisin. Whose story is being told? What an opportunity we have to do something different as we move into the future. We're going to turn over our time together to Dr. Menes.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for your participation today. Dr. Voisin, thank you for this timely lecture based on your life's work and your scholarly insight. Dr. Fletcher, thank you for moderating this discussion and taking on the role of keeping things rolling and taking questions from our audience, which contained community members, academicians, students, people from across Cleveland. And to Drs. Barksdale and Benninger, thank you for taking questions from the audience and providing your comments and providing that view from our local Cleveland community experience here and your work. If people in our audience, guests have found that this topic is something you'd like to delve into more deeply and think about application to your research work, the Schubert Center for Child Study has developed, with the help of our new postdoc, Dr. Amy Fisher, a guide designed to assist you. Please visit the Schubert Center website to access a guide called Getting Started, Embedding Child and Youth Research with an Anti-Racist Frame. This guide provides critical questions to ask about your research, as well as links to resources that you can use for self-study on your own or within your research group. I want to give a sincere thanks to our campus and community partners, the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences, Mary Ann Swetland Center for Environmental Health, and the Social Justice Institute for our campus sponsors. And for our community sponsors, thank you to the United Way of Greater Cleveland, the Center for Community Solutions, and Youth Opportunities Unlimited. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today.
Okay. Take good care. Thank you.